Okay, so just a brief introduction from myself. My name is Andreas Klieber. I'm Managing Director at Quality Associates and also head up our training organization. I've worked quite widely in the food industry, in particular also with retailers at Coles and in the UK with Marks and Spencer's. And through that, I've seen quite a lot of the global trade in food, but also manufacturing around different parts in the world. And as a technical manager in retail, you do get to see a lot of different sides and things as well as issues. Previous to that, I worked at universities of Queensland and Adelaide, also looking at food safety in the wider sense. We do work with all the different sectors within the food industry, so whether it's retail or FMCG, from dairy to fresh produce, you name it, and we have good relationships with regulators. And we'll deliver quite a lot of different services, including consulting. We look after quality specifications and artwork and make sure that's legal. We do second-party audits and inspections, and obviously training. And part of what we do is partnering with our clients and making sure that we can embed resources or provide weekly support as it's required, but mainly to make sure that people have an affordable service, even if you're a small supplier into the retailers. And we do, as I say, training. It's quite a wide range of different courses we do. You can look that up on our website, but it's basically food safety related, food fraud, food defense, those sort of things as well. And we deal with QA managers as well as training for senior managers and floor operators. Anyway, that's enough about me. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking about coronavirus, and as far as food security goes, I just wanted to say we're not out of the woods yet, and that's because this coronavirus incidence is still going up around the world. And I just put up an example for the US, where obviously the impact has been much, much more significant so far. Lots more people that have become ill, and also lots more people that have died. And so in that space, Australia is actually much better off. But in this case, this US pork supplier, they produce about 5% of pork production in the US. And they've closed down their production indefinitely because they had more than 200 people within the facility coming down with coronavirus. So as I say, we haven't seen anything like that, but that could have quite a severe impact on food supply, especially for very intensive sort of industries like this one. Anyway, I don't want to go on about coronavirus too much today. What I do want to talk to you is about things like food fraud. I want to talk about food defense, and also to some degree about food safety, because as I said, if we don't look after those sort of things, we're going to have scandals, we're having pressure on our supply chains, and potentially we're going to have a lot less food available for our populations. So the first thing I really want to talk about is modernizing food safety systems. And if you're across what's happening in the US, for example, where they have the Food Safety Modernization Act, we haven't had anything like that specifically here in Australia, but we're following a lot of the other countries in the world where we're also seeing significant changes of what a food safety system actually means. And so I want to talk a little bit about food fraud and food defense. And the first one on the left, that image there of the needles in the strawberries, I'm sure we all remember that. And that had a massive impact, not just on the strawberry sector that lost millions and millions worth of product and therefore wasn't available. It impacted on the retailers, it impacted on what sort of foods were available, and it went wider than foods potentially as well. But basically, one employee that was disgruntled doing something that they weren't supposed to do ended up with impacting right across the whole industry. And so you can imagine that if things like that keep happening, that has an impact on what food is available for us. And on the right-hand side, that's just an example of food fraud in Australia, where people just mix together different drinks, alcoholic drinks, out of basically water, alcohol, and a few colors and flavors and those sort of things. So, you know, that might not seem so serious, but if we look at food fraud across the world, it's worth $50 billion annually. So that's a lot of product that's being faked, some of it through people that just take advantage of a shortage in the market. Some things are done systematically by organized crime, but it does have a very big impact on the world economy and what we trade. And if we're looking at what that means to Australia in particular, so basically the figure on the right is showing us what we're losing as a country as far as income is concerned, because somebody put a label on something else and called it Australian. Therefore, we lost that market, but it's also potentially impacting on the reputation of clean and green exports. So you can just imagine if you're exporting something and you're competing against something cheaper that's not really Australian and that's subpar quality, it's going to create us a few issues and potentially also reduce the reputation of this country. So that's a little bit on food fraud and the costs. On the flip side, there are also a significant number of penalties that were introduced after the needles were put into strawberries and so on. Also, we've seen recently that people have been licking food, they've been spitting on it, coughing on it, all sort of things, and putting it on YouTube thinking that was hilarious. But we've already seen around the world, people have thrown out a whole lot of food just simply because of those sort of incidents. And people have gone to jail. And that's, you know, quite rightfully so. It's not a laughing matter to basically destroy food in this fashion. It's just an economic loss, but it also reduces the confidence of consumers. In Australia, there are quite severe penalties that can be applied. So there are 15 years maximum penalty if you're contaminating, threatening to contaminate, or making false statements about contaminating of goods. So if somebody stands in your factory and does a video of coughing on your food and is basically putting that onto YouTube, basically they're making a false statement about contamination of goods. It damages your reputation and it's going to have severe impacts for you as a business. And so it's just worthwhile keeping in mind that those sort of offences in the criminal code in Australia are now considered sabotage offences. And so if something like that happened, you're well within your rights and you should contact the police and investigate these sort of issues. But you also need to tell your staff that these sort of things aren't laughing matters. They need to be aware not just of their normal personal hygiene requirements, but basically that they need to treat any potential contamination or acting like they are as something that's quite serious. So coming back to modernizing the food system. And so when we started talking about food fraud and food defense, we talked about TACCP and VACCP, and we just thought, okay, that's something new we've got to do. But in reality, it ties in with the rest of the food safety management systems. And that's why I'm looking at it this way, where we've had HACCP on the left. We've done that for the last 20, 30 years. We're reasonably good at it. We still have food safety incidences, obviously, and we're seeing that in recalls. But basically, we're now expanding into food fraud and food defense. And in part, that's because food fraud and food defense isn't just about monetary things. It can have a very serious impact on food safety as well. And we'll see that in a little bit. So TACCP and VACCP, so threat assessment, critical control points, and vulnerability assessment of critical control points really cover this food fraud and food defense. And in my mind, that all sits together in one HACCP system, with one food safety systems with HACCP. Now, again, that doesn't live by itself in an organization. It all comes under business continuity. And that's something that I find lots of businesses have possibly a business continuity plan. It's often not that well developed. So it'll be very hard to go in and say, okay, this is now exactly what I need to do if this happens, for example, a food contamination or a arsonist coming on site or water connections being lost, all those sort of things. You need to have some plans around that. And so it's worthwhile to have a look at your business continuity plan if you even know where it lives. And often I ask people that in training and they're not quite sure about it. And that's because often business continuity isn't managed by the QA team, but by somebody in the senior leadership, for example, the chief financial officers. So it's worthwhile to review and make sure that that actually addresses all of the different things that can go wrong, including coronavirus. And that's something that probably most business continuity plans weren't really considering in depth. A lot of people have done a lot of work very quickly in the last couple of months, but quite often those systems don't necessarily work until you actually have to implement it, and then you're starting to ask lots of questions. So review your business continuity. But business continuity covers everything from your supply chains, your operations, your human resources, so strikes, for example, assets, cybersecurity, power generators, water equipment, you name it. I mean, if equipment fails and it takes 6 weeks or longer by sea to be freighted out of Europe, you're going to have problems with production if that is a key piece of equipment and you can't fix it. So you need to have some sort of plans around it. Power generation, most people say, well, we'll throw in a generator if power fails, but they haven't really considered how it's going to be connected up, or where you're going to store the diesel to run it, or how much you even need as far as the generator is concerned. So there are lots of things that people think they're across, but business continuity doesn't necessarily cover. If we're thinking about food security, all of those things impact on whether you can produce, and sometimes can have a much wider impact. So when we're looking at COVID-19, all of our human resources are at risk, and if that was to hit the food industry in a wider basis, that could be quite a significant issue. So as I mentioned, in the US, you've got the Food Modernization Act, and what that's led to is what they call HARP-C. It's Hazard Analysis and Risk-Based Preventive Control, and that basically goes a step beyond HACCP. And if you're looking at what's actually covered by that HARP-C program, it's radiation, natural toxins, pesticides, drug residues, decomposition, parasites, allergens, unapproved food or color additives, naturally occurring hazards, and intentionally and unintentionally introduced hazards. So basically, if you're in the US, you've got now one system, and that includes your TACCP and VACCP, so your food fraud, your food defense type sort of issues. And that's because it looks at intentionally introduced hazards, and it looks at things that you wouldn't normally naturally expect to occur. So unapproved food or color additives, somebody has to put it in there, so that's an intentional act. So basically what I'm advocating for is quite similar to that, and that is that basically we're looking at the whole system of HACCP, TACCP and VACCP as one, and that you're considering all the cross risks as far as that goes as well. Also, if you look at the national training competencies in Australia, TACCP and VACCP is part of the HACCP curriculum as well. So they haven't split that out specifically. So if you're looking at your food safety systems and making sure you can supply going forwards, you really need to start looking how all of that integrates. Just to give you a definition, and that comes out of the PAS 96. It's a pre-standard that they've issued in Europe, and it's a guide to protecting and defending food and drink from deliberate attack. And I think if you're not too familiar with TACCP and VACCP, this is a very good definition, because it says that TACCP is a systematic management of risks through the evaluation of threats and identification of vulnerabilities. So you're looking both at who and how you can be attacked and where you're vulnerable to that attack. And you need to implement controls on materials and products, purchasing processes, premises, distribution networks, and business systems. So it goes much wider than HACCP. It's not just what you're doing on your side, but it looks at the entire supply chain. And it has to be looked at by a knowledgeable and trusted team. basically, so that when you're considering how you can be attacked, you're not leaking that sort of information that then somebody can use against you. So then to think about how this whole thing looks like if we're looking at integrating HACCP, TACCP and VACCP, well, basically from HACCP point of view, we're looking at allergens, biological, chemical and physical agents. All of those potentially could be used also as a means of attack, or it could be quite a undeliberate adding of an allergen, for example, just because whoever's committing the crime doesn't actually understand that allergens can cause health and safety problems. So going then over to the risks for TACCP and VACCP, so you've got malicious contamination, cybercrime, espionage, extortion, and economically motivated adulteration. So that's basically the fraud aspect. And as EMA says, it's economically motivated, so it's based on money. So then if we're thinking, well, how does VACCP relate to TACCP? Well, the VACCP risks are basically specific EMAs. So they're basically a subset of TACCP and generally are applied to ingredients. And so there we're looking at substitution, concealment, mislabeling, dilution, unapproved enhancements, counterfeiting, and things like theft, grey market, and diversion. So that's quite a wide set of different risks and hazards that you need to manage in that system. And if we don't manage those, we can have very severe impacts. And I think we're all sort of aware of where we have been with toilet paper and rice and pasta and those sort of things. This picture here is well before coronavirus. This happened in the early 2000s. That was the UK, where basically you ended up with empty shelves in the supermarkets because one spice had been contaminated with an illegal food dye, Sudan red, which is carcinogenic and definitely not allowed. And that was added to a paprika powder and basically was fraudulently making the spice look like it was fresh. It hadn't been oxidized, so it wasn't old looking. And so just because of them adding that, this ended up in so many different products in one country. And so as a consequence of that, they had to recall all of that product. So food fraud and defense can very quickly start impacting on food availability and therefore food security for a country or a number of countries. And we just need to think about how interconnected all of our networks are, where we're sourcing things from, and how easily we could be impacted by something like that. So this sort of food disruption was very deliberate. It wasn't accidental. And we are potentially at risk for those sort of things. We also need to think that as a business, obviously you don't want to lose the trust of the consumer. That can happen quite easily if you end up in a recall, so how you manage that is quite important. But if you're looking at what impacts recalls and those sort of scandals have on the food industry, generally you lose quite a lot of money in the short term. It takes a long time for people to come back and trust your product. That can be months. But the longest lasting impact is generally on the country of origin. And so if you're thinking about some of the recent issues around the world, there's still people even within China that don't necessarily trust their own food supply just because of scandals like melamine and baby formula. That's why we're exporting so much of that from this country. So there's some very long-lasting trust issues for specific countries of origin. And while I say we've got very connected supply chains, I do want to come just back once to this slide here, which is basically the map of what's happening with coronavirus around the world. Now is the time to be vigilant because we're starting to see that some countries are stopping specific food exports. So Vietnam, for example, and India are looking at that. We're also going to have disruptions in countries like Africa, where we don't have a lot of numbers as far as we know. There might be a lot worse, we just may not know. But if those supply chains get cut and key materials, raw materials are not going to be available, and some of them are very labor intensive, so it's not easily managed, in that case, you are going to run a much higher risk of food fraud. Because if whole countries are knocked out in supply, other countries or other companies may want to step in. And if you don't know anything about them, if you don't know if they're trustworthy, you are much more at risk to be targeted and become affected by food fraud. And so whether it's a mislabeling of country of origin, or whether it's some material that they stretch because not a lot of it's available and they just add something else in. And spices, for example, we've seen everything from horse dung to brick dust go into things like that. You just have to start thinking, okay, if we step out of our known supply base, how do we make sure we don't become victim to fraud? And so again, as far as food security is concerned, by having supply chains knocked out, by being potentially victim to food frauds, we're putting at risk what we have to eat in this country. And I know we probably don't import more than, say, 11% of specific foods, but for those sort of foods, we still have a potential risk. And we also need to think that some of the foods that we produce in Australia do have international content. So some of the foods we may not be able to produce in Australia just because we don't actually have the ingredients to go into them. So it doesn't have to be a whole food. So now is the time to be vigilant and to see what's going on in international supply chains and make sure that you're not becoming a victim of fraud, which at this time, because of coronavirus, is a much higher likelihood than we had before. And as I said previously, we already had a very high risk for specific countries for particular type of products and raw materials. This is reasonably old now, from the OECD in 2007, but that shows the correlation between a risk to counterfeiting versus a transparency index. And what you're seeing basically is that countries that are less transparent, less democratic, less transparent from regulators, those sort of things, you're more likely to face food fraud risks from those sort of nations. You can't basically say everybody's doing the same thing in these countries. There are going to be suppliers that are very good, and there are going to be some that aren't. And so then, as far as your TACCP and VACCP is concerned, you need to manage what you know about those sources. But if you're thinking those countries are at higher risk, you might want to put more emphasis on what you're getting out of those specific countries than for others. Also, just think about if you're trying to protect yourself, you need to look at your system as a whole of supply chain. So it starts with the production of the raw materials and it ends with the consumer and the waste they generate. You also need to think that whenever there's food fraud, somebody's going to come up with a better way of doing it or cheaper way of doing it. So you need to keep looking what's on the horizon. And as I say, horizon scanning also includes things like crises that we're going through with coronavirus at the moment. But you do need to think about how you might be attacked and what the attacker might be willing to do. And there are 3 different levers that you have to basically stop people conducting an attack against you. And there's impacting motivation, determination, and capability of the attacker. And so, for example, motivation, removing that would, for example, if you had a disgruntled employee, or making sure you don't have disgruntled employees would be one way to stop the motivation of somebody internal attacking you, for example. Whereas with a activist, for example, they might be quite motivated and determined to push their agenda, but you can impact the determination to impact your particular business by engaging with them, for example, and therefore they're going to talk to somebody else rather than about you. And then the last one, capability, that's probably then starting to look at professional criminals, terrorists, those sort of people. You really need to remove the capability of them to actually carry out that attack. And so there are different levers you have in protecting yourself. So from food fraud point of view, there's a well-recognized system through the PASS process, PASS 96 that I've mentioned earlier. So there are 15 steps of implementation. And the way I look at it is really you start out with quite a wide assessment of the various threats and risks to your business. And by doing that assessment, you end up with what I call a threat assessment register, which basically summarizes the key risks that you need to stay on top of. You can't boil the ocean and deal with everything individually. If there are thousands of different risks because you have thousands of different raw materials, that's not manageable unless you basically pare it down to the real key issues and you manage those really well. So we do a lot of training and facilitation in that. We also help with implementation. If you're more interested in TACCP and VACCP, we've actually got a course this Thursday. That's a public course if you're interested in that. But moving on from the TACCP and VACCP type comments I was making, we can't forget that this has potentially huge impact on food safety. And this is just one example where in the US, salmon had been contaminated that was imported with peanut shell. And so all of a sudden you potentially have a hugely allergenic material in there. And if you look at how many people have a peanut allergy, this could turn quite deadly. So in the US, 700 different products were recalled. Again, food that's not available, that's being tossed out, it impacts on food security as well as food safety. In Australia, I talked to a number of different ingredient houses that were importing cumin. They did extensive testing, they didn't find it. We also didn't have any recalls in Australia based on that. So I think we were lucky getting away with not having any recalls. And the reason I say that we're lucky is because we're in the same supply chains that the US is getting their spices from. So it could have just as easily been us. So talking then about food safety, I want to make a few more comments on that because again, that impacts on the food that's available. And if we're having issues, that is going to cause potentially problems to food availability as well. And so recently we had a number of different recalls on pesto, for example. And the reason why that pesto recall happened was that Vietnam, one of the two main suppliers of cashew nuts, somehow there was a contamination with peanuts and the raw material found its way into Italy. From Italy, it was distributed around the whole world. And basically we ended up with a number of retailers and private companies basically recalling pesto. And that's just simply because one contamination event somewhere. So you can imagine if pesto is probably quite a niche product, relatively speaking, if that ended up as a much wider issue as far as raw materials is concerned, this could really impact on a lot of foods, and we've seen that with the example with Sudan red. The other thing I would say, food safety culture is probably something that we can still get stronger as far as the industry is concerned. You've got some companies that are really good and others that are developing their food safety culture. But without that, you're not going to have a consistent approach. And we're going to fail because it's not just about systems and processing equipment. People have a huge impact on whether you're going to produce safe food or not. So current food supply, as I said, we've been doing HACCP for years and years and years. We're globally connected, and basically the dominoes there just to show if one of those falls, everything else falls with it. So we're quite vulnerable to those global supply chains. And we're discussing more now in this country also how dependent we are on other countries for other things. It's not just potentially food, but it's pharmaceuticals, for example, and masks and all those sort of things. So if we don't have the ability to produce and these supply chains are disrupted, we're going to have some issues. We've focused a lot on Listeria, Salmonella and E. coli, and that's just because that's where we've seen a lot of the microbial issues. Over the last 10, maybe 15 years, we've focused a lot on allergens as well, and that's because in Australia we have such a high incidence of allergens, of allergenic reactions in people. Whereas overseas, you don't necessarily have the same issue with the same allergens, and that's where sometimes communication issues, mean that people don't focus on the right things. We focus on foreign bodies, and we're very heavily audit focused. And auditing has taken us a long way, because that means that people are independently certified. But the problems with audits is that it only says that what you've seen on the day is safe. It doesn't mean that's what happens on every other day. So that's one issue. The other issue is that it is harder and harder to get auditors, because the aging trends of auditors, you're looking at 55 years plus. So it's not an industry that's getting a lot of new blood coming in. So if we're then thinking about food safety, risk mitigation, a number of things that we can start looking at. The one of these things is food safety culture, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But we also need to start thinking, how else can we make sure that we're consistently supplying safe food? And so if we're thinking about that, automation and those sort of things that we started to introduce into the food industry, we're probably at industry level 3.0, which is basically shown in this diagram. Industry 1.0 was basically steam power and mechanization, the loom being introduced for weaving, those sort of things. Industry 2.0 was then mass production. So if we're starting to think about production of Ford T models in the 1920s and that sort of thing. Industry 3.0, this is basically where we are now. We're automating things. We have computers, electronics, driving a lot of things. We've got robotics as well in place. So we're reasonably advanced as far as managing our manufacturing process concerned, but we're still not capturing data live. We can't audit those processes automatically either. And so that's the sort of thing that's going to come with Industry 4.0. And whether it's using glasses that you project onto and you can see equipment in front of you and the operator knows how to disassemble it and clean it because they're being shown step by step, or whether it's acquiring critical information for your CCPs that are being analyzed in real time and being reviewed by AIs to make sure that you're not out of specification. So I think with this Internet of Things and connectivity in industry going up, we're going to go slowly to a much more continuous audit focus. And eventually, like we're having desk audits nowadays, people will be able to audit your CCPs and see whether they're in control, or you might have an alert that tells you when the CCP is not in control, rather than waiting for somebody to check things at the end of the day. So I think those sort of integrations are going to help us more and more as we're going forward, but that is very heavily technology-based, whereas we also need to keep thinking about people, because they will keep working in our factories and they will need to know what they're doing so that you don't have a recall because food safety issues are a problem. So from a food safety culture, I really love this sentence, and it's a very good book if you can get hold of it. It's Frank Yanez, who basically wrote about food safety culture. But he's saying having a strong food safety culture is a choice. So whatever we do, we have a choice. You can do it well or not so well. It depends on how important things are for you. but it also means how well you engage with the teams that are working within companies and producing that food. So it's something to keep in mind. It is a choice. But looking at GFSI, they're basically talking about culture draws its power from the unspoken and intuitive, from simple observation and from beliefs as fundamental as this is the right thing to do and we would never do this. So if you ask yourself about the companies you're working in, it's very easy to ask that question, you know, as far as food safety goes, is there something that you would do that you're not feeling comfortable with, or that a manager would do that you're not comfortable with? So that goes to this whole question. Are you automatically going to say, we will always do the right thing, and some things we just would never do? So that's a very easy thing to keep in the back of your mind as far as assessing your own food safety culture is concerned. I've written a number of white papers that are available on our website, but I'll summarize just a few points out of that. And the first one is this slide here, where basically it's easy to deal with the artifacts. That's visible equipment, facilities, actions, documents, rules. And that's very easy to assess if it's clean or not, if it's maintained or not. So it's very visible. And then there are the spoken values. So that's what the management communicates to the rest of the business, what people are being trained in, what they're being rewarded for. It's often ignored that reward can actually work. So when people are doing the right things, they should be getting some credit and basically be promoted based on that, not just being punished if they're doing something wrong. And again, you can probably filter out what those spoken values are, because as you talk to people, they will often tell you those sort of things. But it's those underlying values, the unspoken rules, the values, they're pretty hard to assess or to even shift. And so when you go onto a site, you start to think, well, you know, how are things functioning on that site? What sort of culture do they have? And that's quite intuitive that you start thinking about that and feeling some of it because you see things that aren't as they should be. So equipment that's not properly maintained, or even if you're going around the back to see the equipment graveyard and it's all overgrown, you know that people don't necessarily focus on the right things and they let things slide a bit. And so if you're thinking about business maturity, I look at it this way. Basically, a business is quite reactive if basically you just deal with the food safety issue if and when it's needed. Now that's something that we hopefully see less and less in the food industry, but that's, you know, going back 30, 40 years was quite common. You had a food safety issue, deal with it, and basically the issues only were seen because somebody did some quality control at the end of the line. But that's why we moved away from that to HACCP, because we don't necessarily are assured that we're always going to find those issues. So being reactive like that is a fundamental problem. Committed, well, we have rigorous food safety processes and we follow them. And there are lots of companies that fall into that. We are committed. You've got the management statement at the beginning of your food safety manual and basically saying, we're committed, we will do this. But that doesn't mean that you have a big focus on it. In that sense, then proactive is a step better than that. And we're always seeking to improve food safety. That means you're horizon scanning, you're making sure you address this sort of issues. Now that we're doing TACCP and VACCP, we're actually starting to see how we can integrate that. So that's proactive. Instinctive is really, in my mind, the best way to be, and that is we live and breathe food safety at all business levels. So basically the CEO will have no different view on it than the quality team to the operator on the floor, and everybody moves in the same direction, and food safety is at the core of everything you do. I worked in one business like that. It was really quite amazing. Unfortunately, there's still a whole lot of tail of people that still need to get towards that stage. And the difficulty is, if you're a quality manager in a company like that, you have to find ways of influencing and moving people in that direction. And it's not necessarily given that everybody will have the same view as you, or that they will want to have the same outcome unless they're shown the reasons for doing so. And that might include quantifying the benefits and looking at how you actually influence. And that, I think, is a difficulty for a lot of quality and technical people, because we've been trained to see black and white, to understand science, to know when a salmonella is killed, for example. You know, that's pretty easy to understand for us. What's much harder is to get into the psychological sort of things you need to do to influence. And so I thought I'd give you a few hints in that and where that might go. So there's 6 key psychological principles you can think about. The first one is commitment, and that basically means if somebody has made a public choice, they're much more likely to want to stick with it, because it then becomes obvious in front of other people if they're not consistent with their actions. And so getting a senior manager to make a commitment publicly will help. Social norms, so people are much more likely to do something that they know similar people are already doing. So if your senior managers know that whatever you're proposing is being done in very similar companies or people that they look up to, basically they're much more likely to want to do something like that. Consistency means that once a person commits to a small act, they're much more likely to support you on the larger one. So that means you have to get your little wins in first, so that people start engaging with you, and then when you come back and you want to do something more, they already know what you can achieve, and they know what the small thing might have actually done for the business. Similarity, persons are more likely to be influenced by people who are similar to them. And so that's where companies are starting to look, for example, people on the shop floor being interviewed and putting a short story together for the rest of the manufacturing sites, so that they know that when one person was praised, it was for something good in the food safety space, or basically then it's more likely that other people will think, oh yeah, okay, this is great. And, you know, I might get recognized, and this is a good thing to do. Discrepancy, people respond to identifiable people, not large groups. So if you just say, this is good for the company, people are going to turn off much more easily than if it means something to them and people they're directly working with. And then lastly, emotions and fun. So emotion could be, we're proud of our business, and that could be built into the psyche, you know, wherever you're going to be working. But that doesn't develop by itself. But if people have that sort of emotion, if the message gets put across, not with a big stick, big beating over the head, but with a bit of fun, people remember that feeling much longer than the actual message. And so they're sort of psychological principles that you can think about when you start wanting to implement some new initiatives within the business. And so just as a sequence, you might look at getting a senior manager to publicly commit, prioritize easy wins, identifying key staff who can champion things for you. So finding a sponsor that's maybe more senior and that has an interest in what you're trying to achieve, and they can help you along the way. Senior staff are more likely to follow other managers and businesses. So if you have examples of where it's working, that helps. You can use internal staff in roles that are familiar to the target audience to spread the message. Use pride in the business or product. And a lot of people would be wanting to be actually very proud of what they produce every day. They want to go home to their families and say, look, this is what I produced today. It's great food. I've brought it home with me, and I'm very proud to share that with the rest of my family. That's where you want everybody in the business to be. And then lastly, there's an external external standards are now asking for things to be done in the space of food safety culture. And so you have a burning platform. I like this little cartoon though, because one's burning platform is not another's. So in this case here, quick jump, it's a burning platform, and the others are standing there saying, no, wait, it's only smoldering. And I see that happens quite often in businesses where people think, well, this is a really important issue, and other people are distracted, think other things are more important, and so they may not agree with you what a burning platform is. So at the end of the day, when you get an audit and you fail because you didn't do anything on a food safety culture improvement plan, then basically maybe eventually you'll have a burning platform at that case, that stage. Okay, the way I look at it, I quite like a evidence-based approach. So basically, if you want to work on food safety culture, you have to have a baseline. You have to know where you're coming from, measure that, and move on, see what your plan actually does over the next year, and then come back and measure it again. And so if you're looking at the GFSI dimensions for food safety culture, which is basically includes vision and mission, people, consistency, ability, and the fifth one, which is covered by the screen, give me a sec, hazards and risk awareness, you can measure against those dimensions and basically see how well you're doing. On the left there, basically a process of improving food safety culture is like any other business improvement culture. So you measure something, you do an analysis, develop some options of improving it, implement it and review it, and basically keep improving. And if you're looking at food safety culture, senior leadership engagement is going to be crucial. You're going to have to do some surveys and benchmarking. You might work in a workshop to actually work out what you want to do within the business. You then have to write a plan and basically set some targets and come back to an annual review. So while we've been talking about food security today, the things I've talked about specifically that impact on the availability and the quality of the food are things that can be impacted by people. So that's why I talked about food safety culture. It can be impacted by technology, and so we start looking at Industry 4.0 and what that might mean. And we've been talking about things like HACCP, where we're talking about accidental things that go wrong, compared to food fraud and food defense, where basically deliberate attacks can actually impact on the food availability and safety of the products that we produce. All right, I hope you found that useful. So that's my presentation, and if you have any questions, if you want to jump onto our blog, we've got a number of different resources there if you want to look at it, and otherwise, thank you so much for attending.
Thanks, Andreas. That was a really good overview of the topic. So I'd like to open it up for questions now. Does anyone have a question for Andreas? You can either unmute yourself and talk, or you can use the chat function and type in a message. Okay, Andreas, it looks like you've given everyone all the information they need today.
Okay.
So, look, thanks everybody for joining us, and thank you especially to Andreas for giving us such a great overview. He's got a lot of experience in this area, so it's great to have him provide us with that overview. So again, thank you everybody. The recording of the webinar will be available in the next couple of days. And so, yeah, thank you again.
Okay, thanks so much. Have a good day. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Fiona. Bye.
Bye.